Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Brendan Housler with EVOQ Bike. We have an interesting podcast today for you with Peter Defty. He's a biologist and manager for Vespa Power Products, where I really ignored this type of product for years because it was about optimizing fat burning. And after doing the Tim Podlegar podcast, where we were talking about the carb usage, but also blunting our usage of fat if we eat too many carbs, Peter had reached out, and I've tried their product right before I had some back issues and was blown away by how far I could ride on less fuel. But Peter explains why this is important to not be too carb dependent. He talks about how this can be a secret weapon in the heat. We talk about, he was working with Romain Bardet when he was on the podium for the tour and sort of what happened with that and just things that are going on in our gut. And they're not keto. They're trying to strategically use carbs to make us better athletes. I think it's really interesting, and we'll probably have to have a follow-up. I'm going to continue to use the product. I'm not sponsored by them. I purchased the product. I did ask Peter if he was going to come on to do a podcast to give you a discount if you want to try it out. The code is Brendan15 and you get 15% off. If you're an EVOQ athlete, hit me up. He gave us even more of a discount. So I purchased the product with my own discount code. I spent $340, I believe. I wanted to have enough to really give this a full try. So this is not a shill. Give it a try if you want. I'll come back with more experiences. My probably 5 to 10 rides with it were very good. But I also think that could be because I was shifting my diet and learning how to use more fat effectively. There's a lot of variables, right? Good luck with your training and racing. We'll talk to you soon. No, it'll be awesome. I've been looking forward to this, and I'm looking forward to getting back into some Vespa trials after kind of having been sidetracked the past couple months. But I appreciate you reaching out after the Tim Podlegar podcast. And yeah, I just want to chat about this and see what else you've got on your mind.
Yeah, and the reason I reached out was, I'm a big believer that we have to have conversations. The people, because of the cultural shifts and technology driving it, you have everybody in their little tribes now. And nobody wants to have a conversation and throw some ideas in the air and consider things. So then, like what we're going to be talking about today with energy and stuff, I'm hoping that my goal is to have a conversation based on Tim's podcast that isn't like, oh, an attack. It's no, we want to converse about what he had to say because there's a lot of validity to what he said. It's just there's some framing and context, and actually, except for the whole thing about pushing carbohydrates to the max that's currently being done, there's a lot of things I actually clearly agree with him. And it's important for people to know this because I think that he's dead on when it comes to like tracking metrics and counting your calories and calculating your macros and being strict. I mean, he was saying, and talking about too many gadgets. I think, that was like, wow, this guy's totally dead on about this stuff, even though he's in the science, he's trying to build data. Because, like I said, it's right now you can see in the conversation because they're able to push carbohydrates to these new levels for pros. You've seen that bifurcation between the low carb keto camp and the high carb camp kind of, there's this huge chasm and we're like in the bottom of this chasm saying, no, there's a better way here. And
I think that's an important point to make. First off, is that Vespa is not preaching keto. Vespa is not no carb. Vespa is, correct me if I'm wrong, properly timed carbohydrate. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, it's what we call strategic carbs, being very strategic rather than, it's somewhat similar to periodized carbs, but I think that, the problem with humans is we like to control, and then we like to have these methodologies that are strict, but you can't have it strict. Each individual has to be able to do that final decision making. So, you see so many people get hung up on structured plans, and then they wind up being epic fails because they're trying to apply that formula, that commoditized formula, to a situation where it's inappropriate. And, it's learning that and then being very aware of what's going on, what are the conditions, what are the variables involved, and then strategically timing your carbs in and around workouts. And we'll talk about what those parameters are, and then giving that power back to the athlete rather than them saying, oh, like with keto, it's like, oh, I got to have so many carbs a day, or like high carb, it's like I got to be pushing 60, 90 grams an hour, right?
And even more. High carb is
Even
like
more,
yeah.
140 now. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just, and that's just, it's madness,
So this is, before we get into this, not to cut you off, let's do an intro for the people that
Yeah.
might know. Can you explain who's Peter Defty and what is Vespa? And then we'll jump
Okay.
into this.
All right. Well, hi, I'm Peter Defty. I'm the general manager of Vespa Power Products, and also the pioneering developer of a program called OFM, which stands for Optimized Fat Metabolism. So I tend to do things backwards. So I'm approaching this thing from optimizing your fat metabolism. And Vespa is actually a natural catalyst we get from the murder hornets. That's how they are able to do their murder hornet stuff, which is like fly 60 to 100 kilometers a day, kill stuff, masticate it into a food ball, and fly 30% of its own weight back to the colony to feed to the larva. And the larva gives it this peptide that triggers it to access all the fat in its thorax, which is that back part of an ant, a bee, or a termite, or a wasp, or that's how they physiologically are able to do the things they're able to do, is they can tap into their fat stores for high level physical endurance and performance.
And how did they even figure this out? Where did this come from? What's the real quick origin story?
Yeah, it's like a lot of things. It was an accidental. It's like penicillin. It was an accidental discovery of nature. Some Japanese entomologists were studying this hornet, and it's like, what the hell? It's like I said, it has this super endurance, super strength. I mean, they're vicious. I mean, their main prey today is an introduced species, the European honeybee, because the European honeybee doesn't know how to defend itself. And 30 of these wasps, there's some National Geographic video out there where 30 of these wasps will fly into a colony of 30,000 bees, and they just fly in and start ripping heads off. It's one of the most violent things you've ever seen. And it's like, what makes these things do it? And then that's what they studied. And then what happened was, they're like, well, animal cells are remarkably similar across species, eukaryote cells. And so they hypothesized, well, this peptide exerts this influence on wasps, bees, ants, and termites. It would do it on mice and rats, and they tested it on mice and rats to exhaustive swimming. And then, of course, mice models are common for human models, so they tested on humans, and that's how they got this to go.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
And you guys have you sent me some information, and I think there's going to be a newer study that you guys are trying to get underway, but it got canceled during COVID. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was working with Dr. Derek Marks out of St. Mary's in Moraga, California, and because this has been our big thing, is like, we focus on results. So we've worked with athletes from figure skaters, where a long program is 4 minutes long, and he won the Olympic gold medal at Salt Lake City, and that year he won every competition, just because it not only, when you get yourself burning fat at a high level, you become what I call blood sugar stable. And blood sugar stability is for mental focus and then fine motor skills. So like, when you start to lose it, and your fine motor skills and your mental focus are the first things to go before you even sense fatigue. And so we've seen it from that all the way to these ultra endurance, Ironman, Ultraman, 100-mile or 240-mile ultra runners. And, but it's been, what we're doing is so disruptive, because we're using a catalyst to tap into your fat. And, what have you heard all your life? It's pushing external carbs. Mm-hmm. Right. So
go ahead.
It's just it's a disconnect for most people. So it's cognitive dissonance, and I get it. It's like you're telling people essentially the world's round when everything they've been told is that it's flat.
So I think the interesting thing about the product was, when I first saw this, my brain went to, oh, this is for ultra people. But then I looked at what the few participants that they got to start to do the study on, they were looking at fat utilization during VO2 max. So I was like, oh wait, this is actually maybe applicable to me. And that was my first anecdotal feelings of it's a you don't feel anything. It's not like taking caffeine, but holy crap. Like it's just what Colby Pierce calls full open. When you are going full gas, something was different. And I'm still trust but verify, cautiously optimistic. And so that's why I'm really excited to get back into this. It's we'll get into this.
And as we're recording this morning, there's one of our vlogs is dropping today with a podcast interview I did with a guy named Carlos Garza, and he goes by Tito. He's a Hispanic guy in the Northeast, and it's his story about going over the bars, getting a concussion, finding keto to correct it, and he's like loving the benefits of keto, but then when he gets back on the bike, it's like, oh, nothing there. And then he started looking for stuff and came across us, and so he got the Vespa, and then he contacted us, joined our program, and he was doing cyclocross, and he went from like being a high carb middle packer to a backer on keto, right?
Yeah.
And then to winning.
Wow.
Winning like, and if you listen to that thing, he's talking about how he's able to maintain like a 188 heart rate for 45 minutes. I mean, and then that mental focus, motor skills thing was a big thing because, cyclocross is very demanding in that way.
Mm-hmm. And that's something I want to get into after we talk about the Podlegar podcast of the real life implications, because I also then, in talking to you, when I was looking through the OFM optimized fat metabolism, I was thinking, oh wait, so I have to switch everything that I'm eating to use this product? That's not going to work. And you're like, no, this is the intro to that. And I kind of did both hand in hand, and I'm trying to find the middle ground of everything. So I think it'll be interesting to talk about that for applications to athletes that are curious about this, but they're saying, wait a minute, I'm not going to totally change my diet. But I do think this was eye-opening for me. I'll say that before we get into it. But let's talk about the Podlegar podcast first, because I'm sure.
Let's just, I want to qualify one thing. Instead of that middle ground, we want to find your ground, and each person listening find their ground, because that's one of the things. I have 3 constants that I've, over the last 23 years of doing this, because I started in 2000 when I did my first marathon. Okay. That I started doing fat adaptation. I'm like, this carb loading didn't work. So there's got to be a better way. So there's 3 things. And one is you're an individual. Mm-hmm. 2, we're meant to burn fat as our aerobic energy source. That's just an evolutionary biology thing. And, because they tell you can't sustain carbs, you can't sustain glycogen. You got to take in more. So, and then 3, we're made to move a lot, right? Most Americans don't move a lot. So those are the 3 constants. So yeah, let's just dive in.
Okay. Podlegar podcast. What were the big points that stuck out to you that you'd like to discuss?
Well, I want to frame this. So Tim is there at Birmingham, right? And that's the shrine of Asher Jurenkamp's work and all that. And I'm actually familiar because I developed OFM as a result of, I'd already been doing it, been coaching some people and getting fat adapted. I got on the Vespa by accident. And when I bought an equity stake and started doing this as my day job, we started to support athletes. And that's how OFM came about. It's like, we started like, okay, what can we do with the Vespa to make it work better?
Sorry to cut you off. Explain to people, what is OFM? Because when you say I started doing this OFM, what does that even mean?
Well, I started to look, I've got a biology degree from UC Davis.
Okay.
And so after my first marathon, I'm like, this carb loading didn't work. I was really naive. Okay. And so I carb loaded my first marathon, and then I had a sub 3-hour marathon going. Everything was good, my training. And then, at mile 18, the dashboard lights started to flicker. And by mile 23, it was tunnel vision, system shut down. And I finished, and I ran a Boston qualifier in my first marathon, but it was like that ugly bonk, you know, but it only took me one time. And so that got me thinking about it. And that's the reason why I was open when a friend of mine tossed me some Vespa and I looked at it, I said, oh, this is about fat burning. I was already open to it. Just like your journey, like right now, you were open to the Vespa and contacted us because you were open to it because you're like, yeah, maybe all this sugar isn't such a bad idea, which is what we'll really talk about today, right? Maybe there's something else out there than just pushing 140 grams an hour like the pros.
And as a 30-second backstory for people that don't know that, I had this back issue, and we actually haven't been able to catch up on this. I ended up at a Chinese herbalist because he was doing acupuncture, and I was looking for someone to do dry needling, which is what I had done in 2021. And this guy was convinced I was eating too much sugar. Now, to clarify this comment, he is carnivore, which we had some great conversations. So everything that he's on one complete extreme, I'm carbing my face off on the other extreme. And I was thinking, you know, I probably don't eat enough protein. I'm definitely not eating a ton of fat. Maybe I should switch a little bit. But in looking for a solution to back pain, he had me convinced that I was super inflamed, too many processed carbs. And so that's really why I was more open to when I stumbled across Vespa. I'm like, okay, maybe this does fit in here. The long story short of all of that is it definitely wasn't just inflammation. It's like my glutes were basically not working. When I went to a PT, there was a lot of muscular imbalance. I realized I was sitting on my bike funny. So I've been doing PT for 2 months. So a lot of it was structural problems. But that being said, no doubt was I probably I was too pro carb and only eating a lot of carbs. And if you had asked me to go do like a 4,000 kj ride on 50 grams of carbs, I probably would have said I couldn't, or I would feel terrible after. But after talking to you and really going through some of the OFM protocols and using Vespa, and that's another topic. I think it was really more the OFM that did the huge benefit for me, was being able to do a 4,000 to 5,000 kj ride on 20 grams of carbs an hour, which I would never think would be possible. So you really shifted my mind in that. And then, as you said, I'm trying to find the right number of carbs for me. But
well, we'll get you dialed in. And see, the thing is, for your audience to know, Vespa is a great way to start because you can get the experience of what it likes to tap into fat as fuel without having to change your diet. The only thing we tell people to do is start by cutting your hourly fueling in half, because you won't need it. And it'll actually impede you because you're trying to eat too much. That's one of our elite ultra runners did that after he actually had to do Vespa as his only choice in a race that went sideways. It was raining and it was cold and he couldn't even eat. So he was taking the Vespa and he said, there's no way I could have done that it had to be the Vespa. So he started using it and he was using his same fueling. He said, that slowed me down. I had to cut it in half. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just sorry, I sometimes like jump in when I get excited. I was coming back from 5-hour rides feeling way less smashed. And I could go out, do a group ride, ride to the ride, do the group ride for an hour and a half, ride back 2 hours. Usually your, eyes are a little sideways after all of that intensity. And I came back, I couldn't believe how I felt. And so I'm still going to say I'm cautiously optimistic, but there was something to it. And I've had a few athletes that have tried it and they're like, I can't get my finger on this. I'm like, I know, but the numbers are good, right? And the weird thing is too, my last quick comment on that is after, I think on the package, it says, this lasts about an hour and a half, or take your second dose an hour and a half, 2 hours in. It's almost on the dot. And I don't know if that's subconsciously, but I start to feel a little like something is off. And I'm like, oh man. And I look down like, wow, it's 90 minutes. That's weird. So yeah, I'm
yeah.
So what topics do we hit? So yeah,
let's go back to Tim's stuff. Okay. Yeah. So he was, we need to frame this for your audience because he's at Birmingham and that was where Asker Camp, made his name.
isn't it?
Eugen group. I don't know how to say
Eugen
it.
group. Yeah.
Yeah, Eugen group. And so I read all his work when I first started this as my day job because I was trying to, figure this all out. And he and Louise Burke years ago were trying to crack the code on fat adaptation, because it just makes sense. It's like you got these thousands of calories, you got limited glycogen, and how can you do this? They've never been able to do it. And a lot of that has to do with institutional science and scientific methodology. And I'm not trying to knock it because we need science. It's just that the way things have gotten shifted in that institutional academic science and the scientific method, fat adaptation is not as simple as glucose metabolism. Glucose is basically our fight or flight fuel from an evolutionary standpoint. So shift the lens from bike racing and athletics to evolutionary biology. And it's like the reason we store a lot of fat is that's our aerobic energy source, right? And limited glycogen is we have that as our fight or flight and a bridge fuel. So anytime we change energy demand, we're up, we have immediate access to glycogen and glucose because it'll fill the void like that. And so that's how we were, we evolved, we're designed, created, however you want to interpret it. And we have a robust store of glycogen to meet that need if we use it in that context. Okay. And just in our modern world, we've shifted that balance towards more carbohydrates to the point where there's been some very subtle hormonal shifts. So we're studying it based on this modern human in the modern human world, which is probably eating more carbohydrates chronically than we were meant to. It's like I say, we ate concentrated forms of carbs like 3 to 5 times a year, when berries were ripe or tubers were ripe or we found honey, that sort of thing. Yeah, you'd agree with that for most of human evolutionary existence, right? So
yeah, I would.
Yeah. So we didn't eat it 3 to 5 times a day for decades. And what's missing out of that conversation is, carbs work because when you take in carbs, when your glucose goes up, you have to dispose of that blood sugar like really fast because it's toxic. I mean, you ask any type 1 diabetic, if their blood sugar goes up, what do they got to do? They got to shoot in some insulin to dispose of that blood sugar. Otherwise they go into a diabetic coma and die.
Well, maybe to play devil's advocate to that, though, also, if it's not a diabetic person, though, wouldn't that just be getting stored as glycogen? So that would be a good thing?
Well, no, it's your body. That's the thing is like our bodies are so robust and so well made that we have the insulin response to shunt that glucose into the cells to burn as energy. If it's needed for energy, it goes to the liver, it gets converted to fat, it gets stored as fat. And that makes sense in the evolutionary world because in those 3 to 5 times a year when we had access to that low risk energy source, because hunting entailed risk, right? It was a lot of work. So the model, the physiological model and metabolic model worked perfectly. It shunts it. You gorge yourself on all these carbs. Your body produces all this insulin. When you have this high insulin, it becomes fat storing. So that 3 to 5 days that fruit's ripe before it rots, you gorge yourself and it gets stored as fat. And then you go back to burning that fat. So it was always cycling. So the academia, the scientific method, and I was married to a basic researcher who did research not in this field, but in a different field. And I have friends who are PhDs in science. The scientific methodology, you're trying to look at one thing and then you're isolating trying to control the variables, right? That's the big thing. And so with glucose, that's very easy to study because you inject a lot of glucose. It's an energy. Glucose is really just pretty much an energy source, whereas fat metabolism is really complex. It's impossible. You have to use all the variables. And that's one of the things about OFM is like, we're applying the science, but you have to consider so many different factors to get athlete to really burn fat at the levels we're seeing. So it's very difficult for somebody in an academic setting to do an actual formal study in terms of their funding and all that for fat adaptation. Plus, I'll put my tinfoil hat on and ride, but we've seen for a long time, but also particularly in the last 4 years, it's kind of been pretty obvious that a lot of the funding sources for scientific inquiry there has to be something you can monetize on the other end.
Mm. Say that another way, just meaning that like sport.
Yes. Yeah. It's like, scientific inquiry gets funded if there is a way to monetize it and make money off of it downstream.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think that's interesting too, because even like we're big proponents of do-it-yourself drink mix, and how much money have I spent before I realized just putting sugar in a bottle? Or you wouldn't promote that, but
I would. We'll talk about that.
Maple syrup in a flask as opposed to buying gels, which I switched about in 2018. I started just making my own stuff, and I'm like, wow, what a waste of money before, but didn't know any better. But yeah.
It's like Rob Wolf just released how to make your own LMNT, and because it's salt with flavoring in it. And it's like, all this stuff is like, we work with people to do that. If you want the convenience of the gels or the drink mixes, that's great and you can afford it. But it's like, this stuff it's sugar and salt pretty much.
Yeah.
And it's
interesting. We get hit up by a lot of companies to like try their product and promote it, and the drink mixes, I'm just like, man, can you honestly tell me that this is better than salt and sugar in a bottle? And some people get kind of angry when I say that, and that is that's like their reaction is the answer enough that I need to hear. I'm like, I'm not being nasty, it's just the truth. So
yeah, and it's like, you can buy your own maltodextrin and make your own drink or gel mix. It's not, it's just the way they package it and all that. And so, I do personally, I rarely take a gel. I've got some, but I usually get them for free. Somebody tosses me a gel I use Bit of Honey or Jolly Ranchers and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. How many grams of carbs do you take an hour if you're doing like a solid endurance session, or does it?
I have not been doing anything really high intensity. I go long, so it's like I did 15 miles, 3.5 hours, and it's with 3,600 feet of climbing, and that's not it. I didn't take in anything. I may have taken in 100 calories for that 15 miles. It's like, and I wouldn't have even needed to do that. I would have taken, a couple of Vespas during, that's it. And salt and water.
This is, and maybe I'm jumping ahead, but that's the one thing about OFM that in finding what we said, the middle ground for me, like I enjoy eating carbs, and I had thought about this when we first started talking a few months ago. Not eating carbs doesn't sound fun to me. Part of the reason I love riding is getting to eat. And how much do you think eating carbohydrate ruins or takes you off track with fat metabolism? Like, how strict does someone have to be for the listener that's going to say, this sounds kind of interesting, but I don't even know if I can commit to this?
It's all about building metabolic capacity. And Tim actually referred to that to a certain extent. He didn't say metabolic capacity, but and that's your mitochondria and your cell wall fatty acid layer that traffics the stuff in and out. You have to build that metabolic capacity. And when you have the metabolic capacity, you'll have the metabolic flexibility to tolerate the carbohydrates. You can have metabolic flexibility because your body's going to burn what it's given to burn. Mm-hmm. Right? It's just that if you really want to have the performance and health benefits, you need to build that metabolic capacity. So you have that deep well of mitochondrial capacity to where if you need to burn some matches in a race, and you use carbs to do that, you have those matches to burn. And this is what we're like. This is my mission in life, or my epiphany, was when I started working with some world-class ultra runners early on, because they'd developed really bad GI issues. I was looking at the physiology of it, using my biology degree and looking at the physiology of what was going on during exercise, pushing a lot of carbs. And it's like, oh my God, they got this all wrong, and they're literally going to wreck people long term. Because we saw, like in ultra running, and you see this in cycle racing, you'll see somebody come on the scene pushing a lot of carbs, and they'll be phenoms, unbeatable for 2 or 3 seasons, and then they just drop off the map with injuries. And that has to do with your GI tract, which is one tier of our OFM pyramid, where your stomach and gut health is critical. And so pushing all those carbs during exercise is really tough on your GI tract. So it's the analogy I use is your GI tract is lined by what they call epithelial cells and your mucous membrane. And think of that like in your stomach and small intestine, large intestine. Think of it like a brand new shag carpet. But the analogy I'll use is it's a tropical rainforest. It's that canopy. And then within that canopy resides your biome. Okay? And that's your first line for defense. And what happens is, if you're racing on a bike and you're pushing way too many carbs, you're literally burning that rainforest down, just like they're doing in the Amazon in Brazil, to that stubble. And then all of a sudden you can't house the biome, a rich and diverse biome. That biome gets shifted to only certain things that can survive. And then that's when you see people develop immune, they get sick at everything. They get autoimmune like celiacs. So you want to build your stomach and gut up, and we have ways to do that. But then, so you can take a little bit of sugar in, and then that oxidative stress of burning sugar, it's not only going to make you go faster, but it's going to be adaptive rather than chronically blowing you out.
When you talk about breaking down the gut, what kind of timeline are we talking about here? A couple years to do that?
Yeah. It depends on a number of factors. That's the thing. It's like, was that person born cesarean versus vaginally? Did they get a lot of antibiotics? Did they get, do they eat a lot of processed foods when they were kids? I mean, there's so many variables, and that's why I say it's got to be individualized. So, we put people back on high collagen foods to help rebuild that stomach and gut. And then, with a protocol of probiotics that have strains that actually colonize.
And when you mentioned metabolic capacity, and you talked about building that, how does somebody build that up?
It's through nutrition. That's fat metabolism. Because like I said, glucose it's like instant energy, right?
We're just eating more fat, like shifting your diet.
Well, fat metabolism, because fat, when people talk about protein, they're only giving you half the story. Protein is best assimilated with fat. And protein, most of your natural food sources of protein come with significant fat. Like a whole egg, the yolk is mostly fat. It's cholesterol is fats. All right. And so, a nice well-marbled steak got fat in it. A chicken with the skin on it, it's got fat in it. And so what people don't talk about is like protein assimilation. If you take a bunch of naked protein, like a skinless chicken breast, a lot of that protein doesn't get well assimilated because it doesn't have the fat. Because what happens is, when you eat, the stomach acid breaks things down. The bile response from your gallbladder is an emulsifier, and that emulsifies the fat and protein so it can be taken up into the plasma, to the portal vein, to the liver, so you can digest it. So the protein is actually attached to fat molecules, which allows you to do the digestive, so you can properly assimilate protein. And then, a lot of your vitamins, your key vitamins like vitamin A, vitamin K2, vitamin D3, a lot of your critical vitamins are fat soluble. So it's a very, all your rebuilding, building up, when we're talking about building metabolic capacity, that's all done on fat metabolism. There's two sides of fat metabolism. There's the energy side, And then there's everything in your body is built on fat. It's your cells, your hormones, your enzymes. It's all through a process of fat metabolism. So you want to optimize that for that reason as much as anything else.
Definitely felt better finding my balance with more fat. And honestly, when I was getting off and kind of like decarbing a little bit from way too much carb, I was, the leanness of my body increased, which was somewhat surprising to me. And it really opened my eyes to, I guess I'll call it fueling properly. And I had even tracked calories at different points of my like racing career, we'll call it. Initially, I didn't know anything about nutrition. I was a standard or uneducated American guy that didn't know anything about nutrition until I found cycling in 2008. And so I started counting calories initially just to learn about how much food I was eating, and then got away from it because I did get obsessed with it, and then went back to sort of look at how many carbs I was eating and like the ratio of macronutrients. And I wouldn't say, I would more eat what I would eat during a day and then track it towards the end, so I wouldn't influence what I naturally would want to eat. And I was like, wow, I eat so much carb. I used to eat way too much fruit because I was told as a kid, like, fruit's good for you. No one really addressed the sugar aspect in where I grew up. So yeah, it's been interesting. And I think a lot of the things you were just talking about were a huge point that Tim talked about of, if you go 120 gram carb right out of the gate, you're really putting a dent in the amount of fat that you're going to use as fuel. And it was really good to hear that.
And this is a good point to talk about the paradigm shift, which Tim is, because he's at Birmingham, he's going with the conventional science. And I'm kind of surprised with can I do a screen share, by the way? We should be able to do, I think I can.
There's share on the bottom there. Can you see it?
Okay, good. Yeah. So anyway, we'll do a couple of things here. So what I want to show you, share, let's see.
Should be right next to script and leave.
I'll have to put my glasses on because I'm an old dude. Here we are. Here we go. Share. Okay. Screen. All right, let's see what we got here.
So what are you going to be showing us?
So Tim talking about impacting fat oxidation. This is a good place to start because I caught that, and it was what his quote was using the old science. And let me see, window, entire screen. Here we go. Boom. Okay. So this is a graph I made, and Tim was talking about, how fat oxidation was impacted. He pulled out the number 0.5 grams per minute, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it would go down to 2.2 or 0.3. Well, that's here. This is the Venables study in 2005 he's quoting. And it showed that the absolute ceiling for fat oxidation was 1 gram.
Mm-hmm.
And most people—
Is that 1 gram per minute?
Yes, 1 gram per minute fat oxidation. That was like what was considered the absolute ceiling of what humans could burn. Okay, and most people burned 0.5 gram or less. Here's 0.5. So you see how that clusters right down there. So his numbers are based on that science. Now the faster study, which was Volek and Finney study, and they call them keto adapted because their conformational bias is towards keto, and they think it's just the diets. Like I say, they're being scientists. They're studying one thing. I'm like, we use aspects of low carb, but there's all kinds of other things going on. So the faster study, the 10 out of the 12 fat adapted, I call them fat adapted, but keto adapted athletes were my guys. And you can see this is a conventional group of high carb ultra runners, and they had really good fat oxidation rates. Their mean was 0.67. So they were right in the conventional science, on the upper end of the conventional science about what they matched what the conventional science said. about fat oxidation. This is why, when you look at these numbers, half a gram, this is why fat is not considered a viable substrate for performance fueling. Now, the faster guys, and this is really interesting, these are my guys all up here, and the mean was 1.54, and it was getting pulled down by these two guys. They had two guys Finney and Volek, who were strict keto. They weren't winning races. The guys that were winning races that were performing, these were all guys I work with. And they were using Vespa, they were using strategic carbs, they weren't eliminating carbs. They built up their capacity. So that was the faster study, which was published in 2015. Now, in 2022, so a little over a year ago, we did some pilot testing, and I'm cherry picking. This is cherry pick data. I had two guys who live in Flagstaff, so they're getting altitude, acclimatization, all that. But this is the test of cherry pick data. So I'm using this because this is what's possible, and this is data. It's not a scientific study, but it's data. We didn't try to manipulate it or anything like this. And this is after a week of hard training, and the day before he had 7 vials of blood drawn. So it wasn't ideal conditions. But if you look at the test, he starts out immediately at 1 gram at very low intensity. And as soon as they got him jogging, he goes up to 1.5 grams. And he can run 1.5 grams all day long. And both he and Jeff, this is Jeff Browning, the other guy who lives in Flagstaff, very similar profile. They can hold over 2 grams a minute for 15, 18 minutes.
It's interesting.
That's it. And then they don't even cross over in this test. This is the glucose. And this is why I say glucose is a bridge fuel, because you see these little blips in the glucose. Okay. That's where they were shifting up the speed, because every 4 minutes, we were increasing the speed to 9 miles an hour. And at the very end, we were increasing the grade. So you see
what's the labeling below the yellow line that you're at? The light, the teal, blue, the purple, the pink. Is that how fast they're going?
That's how fast they're going. Yeah.
Okay.
And
send me this image if you can when we're done.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when they're going here, where you start to see the fat oxidation come up, it's not like ultra endurance slow. It's like sub 6 minute pace.
The thing that I want to highlight too, that you said that I think is really important, that I remind myself of, is you're using aspects of low carb. And just to remind, you're not low carb, because when I had done an email series that I just like training musings, and I started talking about this a little bit, when I thought that my back pain was more inflammation based. And I got a couple emails that were like, I can't believe you're going low carb. This is crazy. You've been talking about the importance of carbs for so long. I said, hold on a second. I said, please reread my email. I did not say I'm going no carb, low carb. I'm trying to utilize fat in a more effective manner, because I feel like I'm too carb. And so I just think it's important to restate that. And also, I think one of my biggest pushbacks initially was, I don't want to change what I'm doing, and it's hard to change sometimes, but I think that, I'm just excited to keep going with this, because I don't know how to best describe the feeling, but I felt more fluid on the bike.
I'll show you some stuff that'll show you that you're kind of you're on the right path. Okay. So we'll open, I'm just going to share this screen.
Can we publicly mention Romain, or is that
Oh yeah, no, we can.
So on your website is a picture of Romain Bardet from AG2R. Probably 90% of the people listening to this know who that is. Can you give a quick story about that? Because I think, when I saw him, sorry to cut you off, to see him in the tour, how well he did, and then, no offense to him, kind of fell off. You guys might have something to do with that.
Yeah, we had a lot. Well, one of the doctors I work with is Dr. Jonathan Edwards. He's a Cat 1 cyclist. And he came to me years ago after going over the bars on his bike, and it injured him. He had a serious TBI. And, this was like not only life-threatening, but career-threatening. Like, could he go back to being an anesthesiologist and a sports doctor? And so he started looking up ways to accelerate the healing of his TBI, and found the keto diet and started doing the keto diet to get healed. And as he got healed, he got back on the bike, and that's where he found out the limitations of keto, right? As a cat one cyclist. So he started looking around some more, and that's how he found me. And we hit it off, and he's a really sharp guy. And he actually lives in Florida now in New Smyrna Beach area.
Okay.
But he was in Vegas. Anyway, he's not only is a cat one cyclist, but he's a 110% Francophile. And so he has a house in the south of France and goes there and rides and stuff like that. So he knew I was working with cyclists. I work with Carlos Sastre, what's his name? Xavier Tondo, the guy who backed his car into himself in the garage door.
I don't know that guy.
Yeah, he was back then, Carlos Sastre. And then I was working in 2010. I worked with Tadej Vajovec, a Slovenian.
Okay.
He was the lead, the GC guy for AG2R in 2010. And I actually flew out to Italy and then just leave Slovenia to check him out because he was getting his training. He was getting his training from Dr. Ferrari, the Dr. Ferrari.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. No, and I actually hung out with Dr. Ferrari for about 4.5 hours that day. They were doing training, and they were doing the training on the same hill that Lance used to train in out of Rio Veggio, 6 kilometer. And I we never talked about any of that. And it was in 2010, and that was the time where Ferrari was saying, "Don't do anything because they got a test for it." But today was working with him because he wanted the best coach, and I was there to make sure he was clean. But Ferrari, I don't know anything about that side, and that's above my pay grade. Like I say, I'm a biologist. I understand science, but when it comes to pharmaceutical stuff, that's out of my league, right? The natural stuff, food, stuff like this, I'm competent in. But anyway, I have to say, Ferrari he's a very curious sort. And we never talked about anything like that, but just looking at what he was doing and how he was doing it based on lactate and VO2, the guy knows what he's doing. Very interesting because he was tracking with lactate, and that's something that's a big subject right now. That lactate testing and lactate training, and we can talk about that too. But then with Dr. Edwards, he was a Francophile, and he was in touch with Roman and. We started working together, and he and Dr. Edwards and we got him on the Vespa and got him doing a couple things. And his spring training went really well. I think it was 2015 or 16 where he got second in the tour.
I can't remember exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, that year we were working very closely with him and just him, and got him fat adapted and got him using the Vespa. And, that year he just rode really strong. That was during that Chris Froome era. Right. And then like 2.5 weeks in, we get this email on the rest day saying how good he's feeling. And then the next day he wins a stage and comes in second at the tour. To a point, at that era, I think it's James Morton was the doctor for Team Sky. He was incorporating some strategies for fat adaptation in the earlier part of the training. That because they talked about how Chris Froome was doing this sort of stuff. And I suspect he was doing a lot of these kinds of things. So we had a good relationship with Bardet. And then after he had that, of course he had all that press because he was the new French hope that a French rider could win the tour. But then the team doctor found out about what he was doing, and the team doctor, being French and very proud, kind of really limited our access to him. And so he was still using the Vespa, but he couldn't do all this stuff, and he was more under their direction. And so, the next year he struggled and barely was able to hang on to third. And I think there was a lot of pressure on him. And, after that, he fell off a cliff. And I'm sure he's doing fine. I want to contact him because, he didn't come from a poor family like somebody out of Italy or Spain where it was their ticket out. of poverty. He was getting a degree in business and stuff like that. So,
Okay.
yeah.
To be fair, I mean, he did. So that was actually in 16 is when he came second GC.
Yeah.
17, he came third GC. He did come in second in the World Championships in 2018. So that's a one-day
Yeah.
race, different beast.
Yeah.
But got the KOM in the Tour in 19, but yeah, wasn't contending for the win. So maybe we shouldn't say fell off, but definitely wasn't on the podium.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was.
That's
He had
so
some of our
interesting.
OFM protocols, and he was definitely fueling with the Vespa.
Do you recall which protocols he was following when things were really
We
cracking?
probably got his vitamin D up. We had him eating more protein and cycling his carbs early. Like during the tour, it's like you're going to push the carbs. That's just, I mean, my thing is like once I get people adapted, especially if they're competing at the elite level, I gotta push carbs on them because like you, they feel so good, they get a little bit carb phobic,
Mm-hmm. I
right?
definitely hit that. Yeah.
And then it's like, no, you if you want to perform, you need the carbs.
What does cycle the carbs early mean?
Early in the training, doing fasted rides, teaching them how to cycle carbs. So you want to see, the thing is that Tim didn't talk about is the hormonal stuff. He was just talking about pushing the carbs, right? And hormones are your they're the ones that manage what happens metabolically. And so you want to keep your sensitivity, your insulin sensitivity and other glucagon and all these things working right. And then just as an aside, the reason carbs work so well in young male athletes is because testosterone will cover up a whole bunch of sins. Young competitive males, it's that testosterone will just, that's why the carbs work and nobody thinks about it, because they're not looking at the long-term unintended consequences. Everybody's looking at what's in front of them. They see that the carbs do well. These guys are young. They got lots of testosterone flowing and it covers them up. Now, fast forward 20 years to where you are now, your testosterone isn't what it used to be. And, you've been doing carbs for all this time. So obviously your insulin's up. And this is an interesting thing is like insulin is a very interesting hormone but we're using it all wrong because we're pushing so much carbs, we're pushing a lot of insulin. And over time, you develop what's called insulin resistance. You need more insulin to do the job of getting that blood sugar down, whether it's shunting it into the cells for energy when you're exercising or converting it into fat. We're using it all wrong as a storage mechanism. Insulin is meant to be very low insulin and high insulin sensitivity. So we're using insulin right now as a blunt sledgehammer to knock down all that sugar you're eating, where it's really a fine surgical tool, because in the context of that blunt sledgehammer where we're using all this insulin to drive down blood sugar, that's not what it's meant for. In the context of our evolutionary heritage, where we're only using carbs sporadically, low insulin, high insulin sensitivity is very anabolic. Behind testosterone and HGH, insulin in that context is super anabolic. Okay? And this is why like milk with the IGF, with the milk sugars, the fat and the protein works so well. That's why little mammal animals get big, is they're not into puberty yet, but HGH and insulin are the main hormonal growth drivers.
So dumb this down for me a little bit in that, I've been so carb for so long, and now, I mean, the blunt question to somebody listening is like, well, who really cares? I'm 26. I'm not. I'm 42. But say I'm 26, and it's like, I'm doing well. Is it because what could happen down the road as to why someone would really need to change? I mean, I think in my mind, I think you're going to be a better athlete if you're finding your middle ground, because you're going to be able to more efficiently use fat and you'll be able to ride longer, harder, and recover faster. But if someone doesn't buy into that, like, who really cares?
Well, it's not a question of if you're going to have a problem pushing all that sugar. It's just when and what form. And the problem is we've dumbed down health on a population-wide basis to where what we think is a healthy model is not healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is in sports, like individual athletics, which cycling, triathlon, running, whatever people do, a lot of the things that come about over time are just considered normal and part of a rite of passage. Bonking is a rite of passage now, or GI issues. Everybody thinks we've accepted stuff that's not normal as normal.
I would push back on that. I would never tell somebody that bonking is a rite of passage. Like if you're bonking, you're screwing up big time. Most athletes, I shouldn't say most. It is shocking to me how many athletes are under fueling. It is the number one thing that athletes, I think we changed their mind on is, nutrition is a huge piece, but I wouldn't say it's a rite of passage. That's not normal.
But it happens. I mean, it's so common. It happens to pretty much every. That's what I'm trying to advocate. It's like
okay,
it's so common. It's so common. Everybody knows about it, and they know they need to fuel. Well, when you say under fueling, I'm saying I'll step back that up and saying, what fuel substrate are you using? And everything's primed for that external thing. It's like we've got tens of thousands of calories on us. Why aren't we tapping into some of that?
So I'll say I have cracked when I think of when I first got into gravel in 2017, 18. I was living in Memphis, and there are a few races or super long. I shouldn't say super long anymore because super long is like over 10 hours. But if I was doing like a 7-hour banger over 7,000 kJs and I was coming unraveled, it's because I was only dependent on carbs. And I have definitely changed my tune to that. I'm so surprised at what I can do on less carbohydrate and feel better as the ride, effort, training session, whatever race goes on. So
Right.
I think that's one thing that has been a mega change.
Well, and here's the thing. I've got some things I want to show you. We'll save it, but here's the thing. You want to make that shift because not only will optimizing your fat metabolism, it works both ways because biology doesn't exist in a vacuum, and we tend to compartmentalize things. So optimizing your fat metabolism, actually done properly for performance, it'll give you health. But when you optimize your fat metabolism, you can actually optimize your carbohydrate metabolism for those big pushes. Say you have a break and you got to go with it now and you got to put out some serious watts for a couple of minutes. When you optimize your fat metabolism properly, you actually have developed the aerobic capacity to burn those matches when you need to, because you need twice the oxygen per ATP when you do beta oxidation, which is the true fat burning, not keto. Keto is a byproduct. Beta oxidation requires twice the oxygen per ATP that burning glucose does. So when you develop that big aerobic engine, the kind that I showed you, the 2 gram per minute, you need a lot of oxygen carrying capacity. Well, say you got to switch to immediate glucose. Say, you're droning along at 1 gram a minute. Peter's droning along at 1 gram a minute. Well, all of a sudden he has to break. Well, fat's not going to do that, make up that difference immediately. It's going to need carbs. Well, when you have that aerobic capacity to burn a lot of carbs real fast, that's what fat metabolism does for carbs. On the other hand, carbs properly timed will help develop your fat metabolism because it's adaptive. It gives you that performance push to tell your cells, hey, I got to get stronger, more robust, build more mitochondria. And that's the problem that the keto camp won't admit to. It's like you can never get out of second gear. And so you're never going to get that push to get the adaptive stress you need to build. Plus you're down regulating your PDH pathway, which allows you to access all that sugar. We make sure that the pyruvate dehydrogenase or PDH pathway is totally ramped up because that's necessary for being able to burn glucose at high rates. You need the oxygen and you need the PDH pathway because that's what breaks down glucose into pyruvate and lactate.
I mean, I have a very small N of experiences, but I will say there's a very fast group ride in Florida, And right before my back exploded, there were a couple of times where guys rode up to me after, like, dude, what are you doing? I'm like, I took this Vespa stuff. I like the nitro gear was insane. And I mean, I'm since I only have a few experiences, I'll say it again, I'm cautiously optimistic, but it was like, okay, legs are feeling good today.
Yeah.
But coming up on an hour here, what's maybe a last topic that you want to hit on, or we might even have to circle back in a few months and
well, let me share this, because this is important. This is a 6-month. This is like, if you're fueling conventionally, this is what 6 months of sugar. This is how much sugar you're taking in. This is what people need to understand. Carbohydrates equals sugar is glucose, and I did the math, and it's a lot of sugar. So
good amount of sugar.
It's a lot. That's 150 pounds of sugar. So if you just do the math, 26, 200, and I'm being conservative, 200 calories an hour. That's not, that's
super conservative.
Right. That's super conservative. And then say 2,000 calories a day of base diet with 60%. That's conservative, right? Mm-hmm. So we're talking 155 pounds. Most of y'all are eating your body weight in sugar in a 6-month period.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a lot of sugar. So we're not saying, I'm not saying, I'm going to stop the share. We're not saying eliminate the sugar like keto. It's like, if you take a third out, you've just eliminated 50 pounds of sugar. You still have 100 pounds of sugar to play with. You take out half, that you still have 75 pounds. Now, if you're a hyper adopter like Peter or Jeff, you take out 100 pounds, you still have 50 pounds of sugar, what we call strategic carbs, to play with during that 6-month period. So, how much sugar you're going to use depends on a lot of different variables, but it's timing it. So when we talk about insulin, like on your recovery days, you want to go low carb. It's dynamic. Like I said, biology doesn't exist in a vacuum. And most of these plans, they tell you, oh, this is what your macro is every day, every day, every day. This is what your calories are on this day. And it doesn't change. Well, you want to time it to where you go lower carb in your recovery, like going into your recovery, like say after your ride on Sunday, you go low carb Sunday afternoon, Monday, and then say Monday night, you'll bring some carbs back in to get ready for Tuesday morning. Mm-hmm. And depending on and then you might even do a small refeed to trigger that insulin response. If you get yourself metabolically fit, get the metabolic capacity up, get your insulin low, you want to do a small refeed of carbs after a hard workout or a long workout, because that'll trigger that insulin sensitive response, which will be anabolic. Right? It'll help drive with the HGH and all that to drive it. And it's so, we see like a metabolically fit young male, we see them typically pushing anywhere from 300 to 500 calories or grams of carbs the day before a big race. And it just makes them go fast. Doesn't impact their fat metabolism. Just makes them go fast. And then they're fueling, it's around this 200 calories an hour, up or down, 150 to 250. And again, variables matter. In the winter, you can push the calories. You can go 250, 300, and it'll just make you go fast. In the heat, like now that spring is here in Florida, you're going to be down. And this is where the Vespa, the fat adaptation, can really work for you as a secret weapon. You trickle in some simple sugars, because going back to what I was saying about the stomach and gut, and Tim was right about this, but I'll expound on it. When you're trying to perform in warmer temperatures, especially if you have not adapted yet, this is the time of year where people come out of winter training into spring training, and their mitochondria literally hasn't reshaped itself to dissipate the heat. And so your body is shunting the blood flow from the muscles and the mitochondria to the skin surface to sweat, to cool you. It's putting the stomach and gut into sleep mode, so there's not a lot of blood flow. So the oxidative stress of trying to digest goes real high. And then you can get to where the gut totally shuts down. And then that stuff starts to ferment. The calories in your stomach and gut ferment. And that's where you get the really bad GI issues because you're really impacting your GI tract in the heat. So you want to trickle in simple sugars with the right osmolarity of electrolytes and water.
So that's why people are cracking in the heat with the massive like gut problems. Their gut's literally shutting down because it's trying to cool all the blood's going to try and cool them as opposed.
It's allocation of resources.
And so you're saying Vespa would help that because you're not relying on those calories in your stomach. You're just burning fat instead.
Yeah, getting fat adapted and without impacting your carbohydrate metabolism. Getting on the Vespa, it's a secret weapon in the heat. It just, you can just, as long as you stay hydrated, and then that's really getting enough sodium and water. I mean, that's a key thing. Hydration in the heat is more important than the fueling in the heat. And it's getting that right balance of electrolytes, mostly sodium, to water, and keeping yourself cool. If you can dump cold water on you, that's great too. But you know, your body will absorb simple sugars and fluid in the right osmolarity, which means the right balance of electrolytes to water. It'll just pass through osmotically, not have to be digested. And so you can maintain hydration in the heat. And like I said, this time of year, you have to go through that heat adaptation. And hydration is one of the most dynamic things in exercise. It's constantly changing depending on temperature. And then also the concentration of your sweat is changing. Like this time of year, you go from winter where you have a high concentration of sodium in your sweat to summer where your body adapts to conserve the sodium. You're still using a ton of sodium, but the concentration in the sweat is lower because it's trying to conserve it. And that over that 2 or 3 weeks of riding in the heat and really suffering like this time of year, that's because your mitochondria are literally reshaping themselves to be able to manage that heat load better.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I noodle out on all this stuff. So there's a lot going on.
There is a lot.
There's a lot going on, and trying to keep track of all that science is impossible. So, but the actual execution, you know, like what I'm telling you, this is what you do, Brendan. It's remarkably easy, and it gets really easy and intuitive after a while. If you work with me and we kind of get you really super adapted, go put you through a metabolic reset. If you have the time to do it, we might do a mini reset. You know, you get that.
Well, I had done that before. Months ago. I mean, I would probably maybe have to redo it, but yeah. Hey, in essence of time, I think this is a good stopping point. There's a lot in here for people, and maybe I'll have to circle back after I have more experience and I have some more questions on different topics. But I'm going to put the links in if people want to try the product out, where they can find it. There's a ton of information on the website. Any other kind of parting points for the people briefly that you want to make?
Well, like I said, today's vlog is Carlos's, and it's, you know, his journey. I actually listened to the podcast when we were writing up the blog piece, and it was like really good, you know, applied science, a real person doing this that's probably similar to profile, that's, you know, was able to go from the middle of the pack on high carb to the back of the pack on keto, to winning races on Vespa and OFM. And you know, as you know, cyclocross requires, it's balls out and super demanding in terms of focus and fine motor skills. So it's a good thing. And then, yeah, you know, we've worked with some pretty high level cyclists, including you. And
we'll put me at mid-level.
Okay.
There's higher.
Right.
Yeah, don't put me in the high camp. No pressure.
Well, no, we're all trying to be our best athlete, right? And so for the audience, you know, it's like you don't have to sacrifice health for performance. I have a firm belief that the best performing athlete, when they're metabolically fit, is also going to be the healthiest. I mean, this is the kind of insights we're seeing because, you know, I've got Jeff Browning is 52 years old and still one of the top 10 ultra runners in the 100-mile and above thing on a global level. Like he's still in the top 10 globally at 52. And so we're seeing that this is going to slow down the aging process. It's helping people to enjoy life, not just their sport. Like you said, you felt good. It's just a weird feeling. And it's like people aren't used to tapping into their own unlimited potential. So that's what we're doing.
Cool. Peter, thanks, everybody. We'll post all the links down below, chapters, if you want to hit on specific topics. Good luck with your training and racing, and we'll talk to you guys soon.